This is the moment when many people think they understand what's happening in Iran, but in reality, they're only seeing the surface.
Iran's supreme leader has now publicly blamed the United States, and Donald Trump by name, for what he describes as casualties, damage, and unrest inside the country.
On its own, that sounds familiar. Almost expected. But here's the part that changes everything. This statement did not come at the peak of protests.
It did not come when images were flooding social media.
It came at a moment when information itself was becoming harder to access.
And that timing matters more than the accusation itself.
Because when leaders speak most forcefully after visibility drops, it usually isn't about explaining the past, it's about shaping what comes next.
And once you connect that timing with what Washington has been signaling, and what's quietly happening in the region, a much bigger picture starts to emerge, one that most headlines don't slow down enough to explain. During a public address on Saturday, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, acknowledged that thousands of people had died during recent unrest.
That admission alone was significant.
But the framing mattered far more than the acknowledgement. Rather than attributing the deaths to internal conditions or state responses, Khamenei placed responsibility elsewhere. According to his remarks, the casualties and damage were the result of what he described as sedition, driven and supported by external actors. Chief among them, he said, was the United States. He went further, referring to Donald Trump as a criminal figure and stating that America must be held accountable for what has occurred inside Iran. This language wasn't accidental. And it wasn't spontaneous. Because statements from leaders in moments like these are rarely about facts alone, they are about positioning. And to understand that positioning, we need to look at how this crisis actually began. According to publicly available reports, the protests began on December 28 over economic conditions.
Rising costs of living. Currency pressure. Long-standing frustrations over financial stability. At first, the demands were largely economic, focused on affordability and opportunity rather than leadership.
But as demonstrations continued, reports indicated a shift in tone. In some areas, economic frustration reportedly blended with political dissatisfaction, evolving into calls for broader change, including challenges to the authority of Iran's highest leadership.
That transition is critical. Because governments respond very differently to economic pressure than they do to political challenge. Economic unrest suggests reform. Political unrest suggests threat.
And once unrest is framed as a threat to the system itself, the rules of response change. This is the moment when the situation stopped being about prices and started being about power. Iranian authorities described the demonstrations as riots backed by foreign enemies. Meanwhile, international human rights organizations, including the US-based Iranian human rights activists news agency, reported that more than 3,000 people had died during the unrest. At the same time, access to the internet and communication services inside Iran was severely restricted. This detail is essential. Because when information flow is limited, independent verification becomes difficult and narratives begin to harden. Without visibility, outside observers rely on official statements, fragmented reports, and second-hand accounts.
And in that environment, perception often becomes more influential than reality.
And this information gap is exactly where international pressure begins to operate. As access inside Iran became more restricted, messaging from outside the country grew more visible. Donald Trump publicly urged Iranian anti-government demonstrators to continue protesting, framing the situation as one being watched closely by the international community. He also warned that if security forces continued to use lethal force, serious consequences could follow, including the possibility of military action. Later, Trump stated that he had been told that the killing in Iran had stopped, while adding that no option had been ruled out.
It's important to note. These statements were not accompanied by formal policy announcements. But in international politics, signals don't need formal backing to have impact. Public statements shape expectations. Expectations shape reactions. And reactions shape outcomes.
But the most overlooked signals weren't verbal, they were logistical. Around the same time, both the United States and the United Kingdom reduced the number of personnel at the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. Officials described the move as a precautionary measure.
Routine. Non-emergency. But timing gives actions meaning.
In moments of heightened regional tension, even routine adjustments are interpreted as preparation.
Not escalation, preparation. This distinction matters because it allows governments to signal awareness without commitment. And that ambiguity is often intentional. So why did Iran's leadership choose this moment to escalate its rhetoric toward the United States? One explanation lies in internal legitimacy. When unrest challenges authority, leaders often externalize blame, framing instability as foreign-driven rather than domestically rooted. This approach serves multiple purposes. First, it shifts focus away from internal grievances. Second, it unifies supporters around a common external adversary. Third, it reframes dissent as a national security issue rather than a governance issue. By accusing the U.S. of orchestrating unrest, Iran reinforces a long-standing narrative of foreign interference, one with deep historical resonance. But these messages weren't aimed only inward. Khamenei's remarks were also directed outward toward global audiences and foreign governments.
By positioning Iran as the victim of external destabilization, the leadership complicates international responses. It forces other nations to balance concern over human rights with caution about escalation. It also places Washington in a difficult position. Silence could be interpreted as acceptance. Overreaction could fuel further instability. This is a narrow diplomatic corridor, and both sides are acutely aware of it. In recent days, reports of unrest have slowed. But fewer reports do not necessarily mean stability. They often indicate restricted access. With internet services still limited, developments on the ground remain unclear. And uncertainty is not neutral. It creates space for speculation, miscalculation, and strategic repositioning. In many global crises, the most consequential decisions are made during periods of silence, not chaos. And that may be exactly where this situation is now. What we may be witnessing is a strategic pause. A moment where both sides recalibrate. Where rhetoric replaces action. Where pressure is applied quietly rather than publicly. This phase rarely makes headlines, but it often determines whether tensions ease or harden. Because once narratives fully solidify, reversing them becomes far more difficult. This situation fits a familiar global pattern. Internal unrest. External blame. Information control. Measured international signaling. We've seen variations of this dynamic across different regions and political systems. What makes Iran unique is its geopolitical weight, its influence on regional security, energy markets, and global diplomacy. That's why even words carry strategic significance. In this context, language becomes leverage. What's unfolding between Iran and the United States right now isn't defined by a single protest or a single speech. It's shaped by how power is communicated when visibility is limited and how narratives are constructed during uncertainty. The key question moving forward isn't just what happened, but how each side interprets what happens next. Because in modern global crises, perception often moves faster than reality. And understanding that gap is essential to understanding where this story may go. In the next stage of this conversation, the focus shifts from protests and statements to something even more influential: how information itself becomes a strategic tool during moments of crisis. That's where the deeper explanation begins.